Hi everyone, my name is Ellie Andrews and I'm the Specialty Crops Advisor with UC Cooperative Extension for Sonoma, Marin, and Napa counties. And I'm going to be talking about exploring specialty crops in the North Bay area. So just really briefly about my background, I grew up in Ohio. I've always loved plants, local food, and agriculture. I got my bachelor's in plant biology, field ecology, because I love being outside and working with plants. And I ended up working on organic vegetable farms for a while. Then I did a master's in plant health management at Ohio State University, and I did my PhD in horticulture and agronomy at UC Davis, where I focused on organic nutrient management. So I've gotten to work in a lot of different types of production systems, and now I serve specialty crop growers in Sonoma, Marin, and Napa counties. So that's all the crops here that are not grapes, so vegetables, fruit, and so on. So I wanted to start really briefly by talking about what we know so far about what's being grown here besides grapes. So we have in Sonoma County around 2,000 bearing acres of apples, more or less, 350 harvested acres of vegetables, 180 bearing acres of olives. In Napa County, we have around 90 bearing acres of olives, 20 acres of vegetables, and in Marin, 250 acres of fruits and vegetables. So that's kind of your big picture overview. Of course, there are probably quite a few producers who might not fill out that survey. So if you're out there, you're a farmer who hasn't filled out the Ag Census survey for the commissioner's office, please do that so that you can be represented. But this is a pretty good estimate of what we've got right now. And as you can see, these systems look like a lot of different things, a lot of orchards, a lot of diversified vegetable farms. So talking a little bit more about what is currently grown here, this is my attempt to put what I've seen from my job so far together in a slide. So on the left, we have diversified vegetable farms. They're growing a lot of lettuce and also many, many other vegetable crops, tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, winter greens, cucurbits, brassicas, alliums, microgreens, some squash, maybe some legumes, maybe some culinary herbs. A lot of diversified vegetable farmers also grow cut flowers. Maybe they're growing culturally meaningful rare crops, varieties. And then now we're over here at looking at niche crops. There's some small number of farmers who are growing heritage grains, and we have a small number of folks growing truffles and agave. So adding on to that, we also have diversified fruit systems where, some diversified vegetable farmers might also be growing strawberries. We also have some producers who just really focus in on strawberries. We have some producers growing raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, kiwis, pears, peaches, pomegranates. The big one, of course, is apples. Like I mentioned earlier, in terms of acreage, apples take the cake in Sonoma County. We also have quite a few olives, a little bit of avocado experimentation, a little bit of citrus, some plums, nectarines, feijoa, and so on. So this is not by any means everything that's grown here commercially, but this is kind of the bird's eye view. And so the things that you see in larger text are the things that are being grown in larger quantities, larger acreage, larger scale. So this is kind of your visual map of what we've got just based on what I've seen. And a really cool fun fact is that the vast majority, I would estimate maybe like 90% of these growers are using organic, regenerative, agroecological practices on their farms. So it's really, really common that these farmers are using responsible practices and in many cases have been for a long time. So I know this question's coming up a lot, what could grow well here in this region horticulturally? And as you saw from that last slide, basically anything. We have this really nice coastal Mediterranean climate with, diverse microclimates within that, gets really warm in some areas, stays pretty cool, closer to the coast. So that opens up a lot of different opportunities. And we also have a lot of different soil types. And we have access to a wide variety of markets. The key thing, horticulturally though, is that you need to match your site characteristics with crop selection. So there's a lot of UC resources for this to try to figure out, okay, what will grow best at my site. And then the flip side to that question is, okay, so we can grow lots of things here. What's actually economically viable in our region? And that's currently unknown. I do think that the UC Davis cost and return studies can provide a helpful reference. So these studies describe and outline the costs associated with a specific crop. So this is just taking it one crop at a time, but you can use these as loose estimates. So you could choose one and then, adjust the numbers based on your situation. If you were to grow that crop, what would your costs be, for water, for labor, that kind of thing. And then, I think it's also important to consider from an economic standpoint, what do we actually need more of here in our food system? I've talked to a lot of different farmers, but also buyers, aggregators, distributors, consumers too. But this question of like, okay, well, what can we use more of? And fruit and culturally meaningful crops are common themes that have come up a lot with everyone I've talked to. So I mentioned those UC Davis cost studies, those are focused on one specific crop. But if you're thinking about economics, a lot of local farms here, like I mentioned, tend to grow many, many different crops. So you might want to consider estimating your crop specific costing. So you need to know your cost of production for each crop so you can understand, okay, which crops are actually profitable for me in my situation. And time studies can help with that. This is just one piece of the puzzle. Of course, there's like a lot that goes into understanding your cost of production, but time studies can be a useful thing to do, a place to start. And so I went ahead and aggregated a bunch of resources on how to do time studies in this fact sheet that I wrote with Vince Trotter. So if you're interested in this, there's a lot of different ways that you can go about doing this and tools that exist to help you do that. So getting back, to economics and thinking through markets, you want to identify market options that fit your goals. And there's so many. There's many, many different types of markets in this area. It's the North Bay area. There are a lot of people here who are excited to buy local food, which is great. So you can consider farmers markets, community supported agriculture programs or CSA programs. Those are boxes that customers buy on a regular basis. There's a local aggregator distributor called Feed Cooperative, which is very special to have in our region, that source from many, many different farms. And then they handle the distribution side of things, so farmers don't have to. There's many local processors, food businesses that are looking to source locally. You could do farm stands, grocery stores. There are restaurants and chefs who are really excited about, high value specialty things, crops grown locally. There's wineries. Many of them have like in-house chefs or tasting room offerings, and also wholesale. So there's a lot of different ways you could sell your crops. So it's important to think through, what do you really want to be spending your time doing? Which market outlets really make sense for you in your particular situation? And, just big picture, thinking about, marketing and consumer interests in our region in the North Bay area, combined with high production costs here. And I would say they're high everywhere in California, but especially here in the Bay Area, high production costs. It's really important to focus on these three things. First of all, specialness. So you want to emphasize and pick crops that are high value, unique, they're niche. Maybe the crops themselves are, really niche. Maybe it's specific varieties that are exciting to consumers. But the point here is you want to emphasize these are specialty crops, specialty items. They're high value. The second thing is quality. So that goes hand in hand. So freshness, flavor, nutrition, the high quality and low environmental impact of locally grown produce. So being able to emphasize that to your buyers and consumers. And I really think we have a lot going for us in this region around responsible on-farm practices. So, emphasizing organic, regenerative, agroecological practices and educating consumers about why that's important. I do think general consumer awareness is pretty good in our region. But this is, I think, a huge strength of farmers that I've worked with here. So emphasizing that, I think, also plays into the specialness and the high quality of what we can offer here. And all of these things can help out with making your crops economically viable. Because as I'm sure many of you know, farming is expensive. So, there are a lot of costs, unfortunately. It's not easy. You have labor, equipment costs, insurance, taxes, admin, infrastructure, fuel, utilities, irrigation, all kinds of inputs, and so on. So I think, selling fresh offers a lot of different options. And at the same time, if you're considering maybe processing your products, your crop, and maybe creating some kind of value added product, it really needs to be high value as well. And it needs to truly pencil out, like, is it worth it for me to process this into, you know, um, like apple butter or um, various different types of dried goods and stuff like that. So does it pencil out? And you could consider offering agritourism experiences. So a lot of farmers in our region offer educational tours, workshops, U-Picks, and so on that help generate income as well, because there is so much interest in small scale farming in our region. This is a really valuable thing that I think farmers often offer, just to help get folks out onto the farm in a way that works for you as the farmer, of course. But that can help generate income and also raise awareness about your farm and what you're selling, what you're doing, that kind of thing. And it's just great education for the public. Okay, so now I'm going to go over a couple examples of crop options and just add a bird's eye view. I'm going to outline benefits, limitations, and resources for some different crops that I think have been established here, but also I'll get into some crops that have potential. So I'm starting, of course, with diversified vegetables. We have a lot of farms here that grow diversified vegetables. So there's tons of benefits, of course. They're high quality, super fresh, hyper local. We have an extremely diverse and well-rounded range of vegetable crops that can grow well here and that farmers have been growing really well here for many years. Um, there's substantial consumer education by farmers over the last couple decades to help raise awareness about why local vegetables are amazing. So that's good. And just kudos to all the farmers who've worked at that for a long time. And like I mentioned, with most crops here, the vast majority of vegetable farms use organic practices, which is fantastic. And many also grow cut flowers, which are high value and can help with the economic side of things. However, of course, just like with anything, there's limitations. So, for folks who are considering, what could I grow? What crops could I grow in the North Bay area? It's important to bear in mind we already have a lot of established and well-known diversified vegetable farms in our region, which is great. But there's no lack of that here. The economics can be challenging, labor, profitability, knowing your crop specific costs on vegetable farms that are growing 50 to 80 different crops can be really hard. So it can be difficult to know which vegetable crops are really profitable, which, yeah, can be okay in some situations. Some farmers are okay with that because of the way that their farm model is set up. Others might want to know that kind of thing. It just kind of depends. But with that complexity, that can pose challenges for your operation. It also can be a strength, of course. Water access during drought can be really hard. I know that hit a lot of farms really hard before I started this job 3 years ago. I know prior to that, there had been a lot of drought issues. And of course, you're going to have to deal with all kinds of pests like cucumber beetles, violence, diseases, gophers, and so on. So that's just something to be aware of. But we do have a lot of resources for diversified vegetable farms. So there's the UC A&R Organic Vegetable Production Manual. We have a specialty and minor crops handbook. There's a lot of resources on the UC A&R Small Farms Network website via UC SAREP, which are really great. I have a variety of different webinar recordings on important vegetable pests on my YouTube channel, the UCCE North Bay Specialty Crops YouTube channel. So you can check those out if you'd like to know like which insect pests are going to be the worst that you're going to want to know about and be prepared to deal with. And there are a variety of different integrated pest management strategies for all kinds of different pests. And you can find out more info about that on the UC IPM website, as well as the recording webinars that I mentioned on my YouTube channel. And then there's the UC Davis cost and return studies that, you could pick one like lettuce, for instance, and then modify it for your own specific situation. And I think also just buying local vegetables here to learn about what farmers are growing is really great, just to see what people are already doing, how's it going, how they think through those kinds of choices. Okay, so moving on to apples. So lots and lots of benefits to growing apples. They're, besides being delicious, that we have this meaningful local history and culture here, which is great. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Gravenstein Apple Fair. It happens every year. We know they grow really well here. They're nutritious, they're popular. People find them really approachable. They can be dry farmed or grown with very low irrigation in our region. That's usually pretty typical. They're conducive for U-picks and agritourism. But in terms of limitations, it's important to bear in mind that we have a lot of processing apple acreage here already. So we need more apple processing infrastructure to handle that large amount of processing apples, cider apples. And in recent decades, some growers have switched to fresh market apples due to economics, but realistically, economics can be pretty challenging for both fresh market and processed apples. There's a pretty labor-intensive harvest you have to consider. Pruning is really important. You're going to need varieties with relatively low chill hours, just thinking about the future. And you're going to have to be ready to deal with codling moth. That's the #1 insect pest for apples in our region, as well as diseases, gophers, and other pests. And you're going to want to prevent sunburn, sun scald, heat and drought stress as well. But we have a lot of apple resources. So there's the UC ENR apple production manuals. There's an organic one and a conventional one. Because this is such a big crop in our region, I've done 4 apple webinars that you can find recordings for those on the UCCE North Bay Specialty Crops YouTube channel, where I post recordings. We did a really fun apple orchard health presentation and panel discussion at the CAF Small Farms Conference last year with growers that you could see down here. So that was really great. So I presented a little bit, and then people heard directly from apple farmers about production. So if you're interested in that, you can check out that recording as well on CAF's YouTube channel. I have a whole section of apple resources on my website. So that's the UC Cooperative Extension North Bay Specialty Crops website. I have a big list of apple resources. And the UC IPM website is great as well for apple pests. And we do have actually some pretty recent UC Davis apples cost and return studies from like the Santa Cruz area. So that could, I think, pretty easily be modified and adjusted with your information. So that's a good resource too. Okay, moving into olives. So lots of benefits for olives. They grow really well in our region with our climate, and they complement vineyards in many ways. They're relatively low input needs. They have pretty low input needs compared to many other specialty crops. They're relatively drought and heat tolerant, which is good. And olive oil, has a lot of health benefits. It's a local source of healthy fat from plants, which is pretty cool. We don't have a lot of those here. So that's important for our local food system and our needs. However, you are going to need access to a processor, which we do have here. So that's the good news. There are a variety of different processors you could work with. Harvest, just like with any crop, is going to be labor intensive. You will need to prune and be ready to prune. And also you'll have to deal with olive fruit fly, which is the biggest insect pest for olives. We do have a pretty good list of different IPM resources for that though. You'll probably have to deal with some diseases like peacock spot, other pests. And you just want to do what you can to prevent sunburn, sun scald, heat and drought stress. So we have a lot of olive resources. There's the Olive Center at UC Davis, which is fantastic. I would highly recommend you guys check out their website for anyone who's interested in growing olives. They have a lot of resources on their website. They offer trainings and events and stuff like that. We have the UC A&R Olive Production Manual, which is extensive and great. There's an organic one and a conventional one. And I also have a whole section, like a list of resources about olives on my website as well, right below the list I mentioned about apples. And we have cost and return studies from UC Davis on olives, and our IPM advisor, Cindy Cron, in the North Bay area hosts an annual North Coast Olive Field Day. So sometimes it's a field day, sometimes it's a webinar, it usually alternates, but that's a really great place to go get research updates about everything related to olives for our region. Okay, so now I'm going to get into some tree crops that I think have a lot of potential in our region and I think we could be growing a lot more of. And the first is prunus. So peaches, plums, nectarines, and other prunus. So the benefit of going this direction, if you're exploring specialty crops and your options here, we really don't have many commercial prunus growers. So growing more would fill a food system gap here. They're a real crowd pleaser. People love them. There's pretty good demand, familiarity. There's a lot of different varieties that are super fun. Fun for farmers, but also fun for consumers. And we have some pretty cool local history with all of Luther Burbank's work in this region as well. So there's that regional relevance. And they'd be really conducive for U-Picks and agritourism. However, it's important to bear in mind that they have a short shelf life when they're fresh, and then you need timely market access. Harvest is pretty labor intensive. You're going to need to prune and thin. You will want to explore varieties with relatively low chill hours. That will do well here in our region. And you'll want to plant in microclimates with enough heat. So maybe might not work quite so well like right on the coast. But in areas like Dry Creek Valley, for instance, or Healdsburg area, it should work pretty well. And you're going to need to be ready to deal with peach leaf curl, which is a pretty common disease in our region, and other diseases. But again, as usual, we have UC IPM resources on those problems. So we have production manuals for peaches, plums, and nectarines. I recently hosted a peach webinar that I recorded and put on my website, my YouTube channel. Yeah, also a peach section on my website. The UC IPM website has a lot of resources for common prunus pests. And we do also have cost and return studies for these that you could play with the numbers with those. Okay, so now pears. So we don't really have that many commercial pear growers here. We have one pretty substantial Asian pear orchard, which is fantastic, pictured here. We don't really have a whole lot of European pears, so growing pears could also help fill a food system gap, just like with peaches and plums. Pears have similar management as apples, so potentially it could be a pretty easy transition for apple growers to try out pears, and they'd be conducive for U-Picks and agritourism. However, it's important to know that pears are going to have a pretty short shelf life when they're fresh. You'll definitely need access to cold storage. The fruit can be pretty sensitive to damage, and so you're going to need timely market access. Harvest can be labor intensive. Pruning and other orchard tasks are important. And if you grow pears, you need to understand fire blight and codling moth in particular. And there's other pests as well. So just be ready to deal with those. So we have a pear production manual with UC A&R. We have a fire blight, codling moth webinar recordings. Those are a couple different webinars I did in the last couple years, and those are on my YouTube channel. We have IPM resources on the UC IPM website and cost and return studies too. Okay, so now thinking about citrus. So we really don't have that many commercial citrus growers in our region, so growing more citrus would help fill that gap. But please don't grow Meyer lemons. We have a lot of Meyer lemons here, as I'm sure many of you are aware. So I would say pretty much anything but those are great options. Citrus is a great crowd pleaser in the winter when, most other things are dormant, not much is happening. To have citrus to sell is a big deal and very exciting for a lot of consumers. Um, and it can help provide winter employment. The couple of citrus growers I've talked to here say have brought that up pretty consistently, that it's really nice to be able to provide that continuity through the winter for employees. Limitations, we're really still figuring out which types and varieties grow best here. There are a wide variety that do, and these farmers that are doing this so far are experimenting with different things and having some great successes. You're going to want to think about some cultivars that are going to be more frost tolerant than others. You need to be aware that, just as usual, harvest is labor intensive, and you want to at least be aware of Asian citrus psyllid and HLB, the disease that is vectored by that insect pest. It's not really a problem here yet, but it is a problem in Southern California, so you at least want to have that on your radar. And there are, unfortunately, other pests that are here that you're going to have to navigate. So we have a UC citrus production manual. We have citrus resources on my website, um, along with all those other tree crop resources. We have 2 webinar recordings that I hosted on my YouTube channel. The first one is kind of more broad and introductory about like horticulture practices for citrus and avocado, and then the second one is really more focused on economics and scaling up. What could this look like here? Viability. We also have, of course, the UC IPM website with lots and lots of pest resources to help you, cost and return studies, and the UC Riverside Gvaudan Citrus Variety Collection, which is pretty cool. So if you want to check out all kinds of different variety options, that is a great place to look. So, not too far from citrus in terms of, where they're usually grown in more subtropical areas. Avocado also, I think, has a lot of potential in our region. So the benefits of growing avocado here, they're in high demand, they're high value, they're a real crowd pleaser. We have very, very few commercial growers in our region currently. This would fill a big gap. They're a local source of plant-based healthy fat, just like I mentioned with olives. That'd be nice to be able to produce that here. And the good news is, just from talking to farmers and, just homeowners who are growing avocados here already, frost damage seems to be much less of an issue than most people expect, at least that I expected. And I think a lot of folks, usually ask me about frost. Seems to not really be so much of a problem for a lot of folks, just anecdotally. So that's good news. Limitations, we're still figuring out what types of varieties grow best here. There are a lot of options. Some cultivars are more frost tolerant than others. Harvest is labor intensive. You're going to need consistent summer water, but avocados don't like wet feet in the winter. So they can be a little finicky with winter water. So not good to plant in clay soil. Probably not good to plant any tree crops in heavy clay soil, but especially avocados. And part of the reason is that that can lead to Phytophthora root rot, which is a big problem. But of course, in general, there's other pests too. But I think that might be one of the biggest ones to have on your radar if you're exploring avocados. So you can learn more about that disease and other pests on the UCIPM website for avocado. There's a really great avocado production in California. It's sort of 2 manuals written by Gary Bender and Ben Faber with Cooperative Extension down in the South California. I have an avocado resources section on my website, and those 2 citrus and avocado webinar recordings I mentioned, and UC Davis cost and return studies too. So the good news is we have some pretty cool avocado resources to help you out if you want to explore that. So another option I think that's pretty cool and worth considering is figs. So they are high value and fresh. There are value-added options with drying, preserving. They produce two crops a year, which is kind of special. They have relatively low pruning needs. They're pretty drought tolerant, and not many people are growing them here. However, of course, harvest is labor intensive. They're highly perishable when they're fresh, so you need timely market access or a way to preserve or dry them. Consumers might need a little bit of education about how good they are fresh. I think this is something maybe a lot of folks sleep on. I remember when I found out how delicious fresh figs are, it kind of blew my mind. So, yeah, I think some folks might need a little education on that. You're going to want to plant in microclimates with enough heat. So again, this one may or may not do so well, like right on the coast, but in some hotter areas, it could do really great. And you're going to be ready to deal with bird damage, diseases, and we do have some black fig fly pressure up here, and it's probably going to increase over time. So those are just some pest issues you're going to want to be aware of and be ready to navigate. So a really nice resource on this, authored by a UC specialist, Louise Ferguson, and some other folks. The fig botany production and uses is really extensive. We have fig resources on my website. We did a fig webinar with Phoebe Gordon, a cooperative extension advisor, and Mel Thayer, who's at UC Riverside. And so that recording is all about fig production and black fig fly, and that's on my YouTube channel. The UC IPM website, of course, has you covered for figs as well, and cost and return studies too. So here's one more really interesting option. So kiwis, I think, have some potential. So there are very few commercial growers in our region currently, maybe almost none. So this would fill a gap. We have this ideal Mediterranean climate here. These crops do really well here. Relatively low pest pressure. But kiwis can be pretty susceptible to frost and wind damage, so might just be dependent on your site and choosing the most appropriate site location. They do need consistent water. They require a trellis system, like you can see here, and they are fairly labor intensive and at certain times of year. But we know a lot of growers do grow them in the Central Valley around Sacramento area. So they can be grown commercially in California. And we have a kiwi fruit production in California article on the Small Farms Network website, which is a really nice, like kind of quick, big picture overview. The Kiwi Fruit Growing and Handling book. This is a production handbook by Janine Hazy, retired cooperative extension advisor. That's going to give you more in-depth information about production. UC IPM website for key pests would be good to just be familiar with. We have cost and return studies. And if you want a really deep dive, this Kiwi Fruit Botany Production and Uses book is a bit more in depth. Okay, so moving on to strawberries. They're generally, they do really, really well here climate-wise. We have a relatively long growing season. We're not that different from major strawberry producing region, in kind of like the Monterey Bay area. We do have a little bit more heat in some areas, more inland, but a wide range of varieties do really well in the North Bay area. And there's super high demand. People love strawberries here. They're very popular. Growing strawberries is conducive for U-Picks, agritourism. However, they are very labor intensive to harvest, which is part of why I think U-Picks for strawberries can make a lot of sense in some situations. They're highly perishable when they're fresh. You need timely market access. You need enough heat, but not too much. So you need this moderate microclimate. So you do want to be careful and be sure you choose the right spot for this. And you need to be ready to deal with disease pressures like Botrytis, Fusarium, Macrophomina. Because we do have this coastal climate, we have some disease pressure that comes with the humidity and fog and rain and whatnot. So it's important to be aware of. So for resources, we have the Organic Strawberry Production Manual from UCANR. There's a really nice strawberry production manual for growers on the Central Coast as well, which is pretty complementary. They cover similar subjects. We have a nice strawberry deficiency symptoms book down there on the far right. UC IPM website for strawberries has been really well developed because they're a major crop in California, so really good resources there. Cost and return studies, and if you're curious about breeding and varieties and maybe new varieties that are coming out, the UC Davis Strawberry Breeding Program website has a lot of cool information. And a lot of different varieties have come out of that program specifically for California over the last decades. So here's one that maybe is a little bit more underexplored. So blueberries and caneberries. So the benefits of these crops is that mainly not a whole lot of people are growing them yet. They're high value fruit. They could be conducive to U-picks. However, they're a lot of work labor wise. You need varieties with relatively low chill hours. They do need consistent irrigation. They don't really like wet feet. Blueberries need a low soil pH, so they need acidic soil. So if you happen to have that on your site, that could be potentially a good reason to grow them. There are also ways to acidify your soil, but it does take work. And you're going to need to be ready to deal with bird damage. As you can see here in the photo, that might mean netting. You might also have to deal with some disease issues too. So for resources, we have the Fresh Market Caneberry Production Manual from UCANR, cost and return studies for various different berries, the UC IPM website for all of their many pests, and the San Luis Obispo Berry Production Guide is really nice. And then if you want a deeper dive, there are some CABI manuals like blueberries, blackberries and their hybrids, and so on, if you want like a really deep dive. Okay, so now moving into rare, heritage, and culturally important crops. So this is a very wide category. So just bear that in mind. This could easily be its own presentation, its own PowerPoint, but the benefits of crops that fall kind of in this category, these are a way to preserve and celebrate culture through meaningful crops that we can grow here in our region, which is exciting. And it helps improve local access to hard to find crops. So for a lot of folks who are looking for very specific crops that they grew up with, that they want to cook with, this can be a way to improve that access to those crops. It's a way to strengthen diverse market channels, chefs or groceries or specialty sellers who are looking for specific culturally important crops. And they're high value. So that value, by that I just mean, economically, but also socially, culturally, and so on. So yeah, a lot of really valuable crops. Limitations. We do definitely need more knowledge sharing like between farmers and community members, but also like science-based resources about how to grow niche crops from abroad here in California and particularly here in our area. And sometimes finding the right market fit can be challenging in some cases. So, you might need to educate consumers about the crop, how to prepare it, why it's fantastic, what its significance is, and that kind of thing. So, for resources, there's the Specialty and Minor Crops Handbook. I mentioned that earlier with vegetables, but I would say a good portion of that book also is focused on these crops as well. Kind of, more focused in on culturally important crops. We have projects like the UC Riverside's long bean breeding and genetics program, reports such as UCCE Fresno's Southeast Asian Farms and what they're growing, UC Sarep's elderberry and moringa websites. Small Farms Network has a nice like okra cost study. So like I said, there's so many crops that fall in this category. These are just a couple very brief examples to show that there are some interesting resources out there. I think starting with that first one is probably your best bet, but there's also some pretty specific resources out there on certain crops too. But we do need more. Another one I wanted to mention is agave. So the benefits of agave are that it's extremely low water use. And I would say low inputs in general, which is really nice, especially if you're used to farming other things that require high inputs. It's relatively drought and heat tolerant. It's culturally meaningful. However, you're going to need access to a processor, of course. But there are agave processors. You just have to find them. And you want to be careful about your product branding. So you can't say that it's tequila because it's not from Mexico. But you could say California agave spirits. There's different ways to describe it. And because this is a pretty new crop in California in many ways, well, in the sense that people are starting to explore this more, you might need to explore your market options and just think through how you're going to market it. But there's a ton of potential for agave in our region and in California as well. And we have some really, really nice resources on agave. I think my favorite one is the UCANR agave website. So this is in English and in Spanish, side by side. Gives you a nice big picture overview, lots of good information. Also, there's this guidelines for agave selection and production in California manual down here, which goes into some more detail, which is great. And there's something called the California Agave Network, where they do webinars and trainings and whatnot. So there's ways to connect with other folks growing agave, or even if you're just interested in learning more. So we have some really nice resources. And I also wanted to go over truffles. So truffles are really interesting. They are very, very high value, which is great. They have this, nice specialty market, high demand from local chefs and buyers. Inoculated truffle orchards are relatively less maintenance than fruit production orchards. It's just a little different. You're growing truffles in the ground, and then you have these orchards that are supporting those truffles, with their root systems, but you just manage the trees a little differently, and it's not quite as intense. You do still have to manage them, but yeah, it just looks a little different, which is great. And yeah, they're high value and it definitely in high demand. However, you do have to be ready to wait a little while, 7 to 10 years for production. So this is more of a long-term thing, but once it gets going, it can be really successful. And you are going to need trained dogs to find them. So they are trained to sniff them out and show you where to dig them up, which is really cool. A great excuse to get a dog. So if you want more resources, I would highly recommend checking out the North American Truffle Growers Association website. So that's NATGA. They do webinars, they have resources, books, publications, and so on. This is, I think, the best place to go for truffle information for growers here. And coincidentally, NATGA's annual Congress is happening here in Santa Rosa this year in June. So I would highly recommend signing up on their website if you're remotely interested in truffles. This is a really incredible opportunity to learn from experts. And there's a whole lot of other resources out there as well on NATGA's website. But just as one example, I helped co-author this review with a bunch of other researchers about the status of truffle science and cultivation in North America. So that could be a cool place to start if you're just curious about what that looks like here. Okay, so these were just a few examples. There are so many more things that we could grow here horticulturally. So yeah, I would just encourage everyone to think about, what do you want to try growing? You can explore resources that I mentioned. I'd also encourage folks to take classes at Santa Rosa Junior College, at Schoen Farm, to work on farms and orchards and actually get experience, working with established farmers and orchardists to learn directly from them. I think that's really incredibly valuable. So get out onto farms if you can, see what farmers are growing. So go to the farmers markets, maybe sign up for a CSA, go to restaurants and grocery stores that source locally, that kind of thing, just to get familiar with what people are growing here. And as you're thinking about exploring specialty crops, I would encourage everyone to experiment strategically. So every situation is unique, and there are no universal right answers about what's the next big crop, or what should we all be growing. It's instead, I really encourage everyone to think through it for yourself, for your own specific context and goals and situation. It's okay to specialize and focus in on your top candidates. I think sometimes there's pressure to be highly diversified, which can work. And we have examples of that here being very successful. However, at the same time, it's easier, especially if you're just starting out, to compare a small number of crop options, rather than like 50 of them. So maybe narrow down a bit, and don't be afraid to specialize in what you know you're really good at, what you really enjoy, and what is horticulturally appropriate and economically viable at your site. So yeah, you can pick a small number of crops to experiment with and see what works best on a small scale first. And then if you can scale up and you're interested in it and it pencils out for you, then you can scale up once you figure out what works for your situation. And one more resource I wanted to share, if you're thinking, okay, where do I start? I wrote this, it's really short, 1-page fact sheet, just to kind of outline, first you want to determine if your site is actually suitable for crop production. So you want to think through legality, infrastructure, soil and water quality, your microclimate, your access to labor, market opportunities. And then once you kind of figure that out, you want to think through which crops are most appropriate. So you want to match your site characteristics with your crop selection and your scale with your economic constraints. And I have embedded a bunch of resources in this fact sheet, and it's on my website for anyone who's interested. So thanks so much for listening. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I appreciate the growing interest in all of the different things we could be growing here. So I'm rooting for you all and wish you all the best.